Hello and welcome back to your lesson on the ending of Beloved. So we ended on how chapter 3 ended, and then you were faced with an epilogue. And basically, the epilogue doesn't provide a lot of closure, does it? So it's quite an open-ended novel. We're not really given a resolution. It does stick to the past tense, which creates some degree of distance. But the Beloved story is not one to be passed on, even though that's what Morrison is doing by writing this down. So a lot of people forget her, and nobody really knows what kind of came of her, and she just becomes a big narrative gap, if you will. However, the final word is Beloved. So that's how our novel finishes. And something that Morrison has said about her writing that really chimes with this kind of open ending is the comparison she makes between the way she writes and jazz music. Now, for those of you who don't know, jazz music has its origins in black culture. Okay, so it comes from the South of America and it comes from African American origins as well. So this idea of writing in a kind of black style and given a black literary heritage is something that we've discussed in previous lessons. So Morrison says, jazz always keeps you on the edge. There's no final chord. Spirituals agitate you. There's something underneath them that's incomplete. I want my books to be like that. I want that feeling of something held in reserve and the sense that there is more. And I think she achieves that really well, doesn't she, by using things like narrative gaps and this kind of open-ended novel. We don't really know, we don't get the happy ever after, do we, of happy endings. So this brings us back then to that narrative element, that narrative lens in your critical anthology and the idea of endings. So I just want you to pause right now and think about these questions. Why does the novel end this way? What do you think Morrison is saying? And how are we meant to feel and why? Can you compare it to the opening that you started today's lesson thinking about? See if you can use the critical material on this next slide. So this is something from that first section of your critical anthology by C. Brugger. And there are two quotes that I think might be quite useful to unpick in this, let's say, 20 minutes as you pause the video. So the first quote is, that stories either have a happy or unhappy ending may seem such a commonplace that one almost hesitates to utter it. But it has to be said, simply because it is the most important single thing to be observed about stories. So, do you think the ending of Beloved is happy or unhappy? And why might we argue that the ending is the most important of the story? So if C. Brugger is saying the way a story ends is probably the most important single thing about it, why? Why has Morrison ended it that way, if that's so important? The second quote that I thought was quite useful for Beloved. The plot of a story is that which leads its hero or heroine either to a catastrophe or an unknowing, either to frustration or to liberation, either to death or a renewal of life. Do you think that's the shape of Beloved? So does Seth go from one thing to another? Does she completely leave the past behind her now she's kind of exercised of Beloved? Do we see her liberated? Is she finally free in a way that she never really knew how to be in the novel? Is there a renewal of life, which we've always seen kind of coupled with death throughout the novel? Do you think then that the novel follows a traditional narrative structure of beginning, middle, and end? So this novel, as you know, is split into part 1, part 2, and part 3. That would suggest beginning, middle, and end. Is that the style in which Morrison writes? Does she just say, this happened, and it ended like this? So there's something to think about in terms of Brugger. I also wanted to return your ideas to David Lodge, who, as we've said, is a very respected man in the study of English literature. And these were two quotes that I thought were very important from Lodge. Through time shift, narrative avoids presenting life as just one damn thing after another, and allows us to make connections of causality and irony between widely separated events. So, to what extent do you think Morrison's shifting chronology, so going between past and present, foregrounds causality, so the reason why Seth might be struggling now, or Paul D feels kind of isolated from the family, or any irony? So, I suppose the irony in this novel is that Seth escapes to freedom and yet never really feels free because she's always haunted. The second quote that I would like you to consider is, an unreliable, omniscient narrator is almost a contradiction in terms and could only occur in a very deviant, experimental text. The point of using an unreliable narrator is indeed to reveal in an interesting way the gap between appearance and reality, and to show how human beings distort or conceal the latter. That means reality. This need not be a conscious or mischievous intention on their part. So we started our whole thinking about this novel talking about that narrative voice, didn't we? And we talked about how it was almost kind of playing tricks on us. So it was unreliable because it kind of led us down the garden path and then kind of was like, psych, that's not what I mean. This is how it really was. And it seemed to know a lot more than we did. So definitely omniscient, and it's definitely unreliable. And so here, David Lodge is saying that a narrator that's unreliable and omniscient could only really occur in an experimental text. And I would like to argue that actually Beloved is very experimental, and that's why it's been so tricky to read. So, 2 quotes from Lodge there that I want you to think about. 2 quotes from Brooker on the previous slide. But overall, why do you think she ended the novel this way? How are we meant to feel? How does it link to the opening? So lots and lots to unpack there. Give yourself at least 20 minutes to pause this video and get on. Okay, welcome back. So I'm sure that raised a lot of questions, perhaps more questions than answers, which is absolutely fine at this point. You may well be sitting there thinking, God, I'm not going to write about the ending in my essay because that was just too hard. Or you might have just had one really good idea and ran with it. Any of that is fine. If you've got a few good ideas on the ending in response to any of those questions or any of those quotes, then you've done your work. So well done. Okay, so your jumping off point from this lesson then is basically thinking about these narrative elements and how they might map onto the themes of the novel. Okay, so like I said, we started this whole module thinking about that narrative lens, and it's composed of these kind of 6 elements, if you will. So if we look at these 6 boxes, you could think about structure. And I just wanted to be really explicit here that structure is also motif, so things that recur throughout the novel. So you could think about how it starts, you could think about how it ends, you could think about the 3 parts it's sectioned into, you could think about how it moves between the past and the present in terms of time, in terms of tense, and you could think about recurring images and recurring lines even, because there's a lot of repetition in this novel. You could think about beginnings and endings, like we've said. You could think about narrative gaps. So what are the parts that aren't explained that you think should have been explained? So I think Beloved's narrative voice is quite interesting for that, because so much of what she refers to is very elusive rather than very direct and explicit. Also, we never really know what happens to her. So Beloved would be your starting point, I would imagine, for gaps. You might just want to focus on setting. So we've talked a lot about 124. You've done some close readings of 124. Remember that 124 is the focus at the beginning of every single part of this novel. So part 1, part 2, and part 3 all starts with a sentence saying 124 was. So you could do something on 124. You can also think about the setting of Sweet Home. We've done a lot on setting in terms of like America and how it's mapped into what's kind of divided across the middle, isn't it, with that Ohio River, and how we've got the free north and the enslaved south. So you could really think about setting in terms of America as a whole. You could think of Cincinnati and that idea of community that Baby Suggs and Seth find some release in until the community kind of take against them, and then by the end of the novel that seems to have kind of reconstituted itself. You could talk about narrative perspective and style. So all those close readings that you've done of present tense sections, you could think about those 3 monologues that we started today's lesson with. You could think about the unreliable yet omniscient narrator, or you could think about characters in particular and ones that interest you. But the best way to think about those elements is to always map it onto a theme. Okay, so at the bottom here, I've given you some examples of how you might marry a narrative element, so something to do with a narrative lens, onto big ideas in the novel. So you might say, if you're talking about memory, how does Morrison explore memory through setting? Or the character of maybe Beloved, who kind of embodies the past, doesn't she? Or you might say, how does Morrison use structure or narrative to explore memory? Okay, so that's how you would map those up. If you are struggling to think about what the key themes of the novel are, on the next slide, I've written down what I believe they are. Okay, so these are the chief things that I think we've talked about in most lessons. Dehumanization, motherhood, family, community, and love. Femininity versus masculinity, and how far there's actually a divide between those two, particularly if you're a slave. Memory, the past or trauma. And finally, one uplifting one possibly, freedom and healing. So I've put 2 links there to Cliff's Notes and Spark Notes. Cliff's Notes tends to be a little bit more detailed and a little bit higher level, I would say. And you can do some reading about those themes. So just pick one of your choice for today that you're most interested in and think about how it maps onto those narrative elements on this previous slide. Okay, so one of these red bullet points and one of these boxes. I just wanted to also draw your attention to motifs if you were interested in structure. So these are recurring images that we've really kind of traced as we've been reading. So we've been thinking about clothes, which, guys, there's not a lot on the internet, which makes me think that it's quite a unique way of looking at this. Water is a key one, isn't it? Milk, trees. Again, not a lot on trees. There is some stuff on kind of nature, but trees might be a really nice focus if you want to keep this very, very tight. Metal imagery, animal imagery, and blood or the colour red. So again, I put some links there to Spark Notes motifs and symbols, and also Cliff's Notes motifs. They're a little bit different from ours, but I think basically what we've been tracking is more interesting and probably more useful. Okay. So I just wanted to direct you back to stuff that you've already done that you could use for this. So we've talked about point of view, and we talked about how Beloved's death is narrated from the point of view of a school teacher. And here's a little quote from Morrison explaining why she's done that. So why she's narrated that from a white person's stance, from an outsider's stance. And again, think about this idea of like somebody masculine invading that kind of female domestic space of 124. You've also thought about gaps in quite a lot of detail, haven't you? So we talked about how Beloved addresses America's amnesia and how so many of the characters don't want to remember. Yeah, so Seth in particular is kind of suppressing her memories. We talked about how narrative presents history as multiple and inconclusive, a bit like the ending of this novel. And how Morrison doesn't divide past from present. So she talks about rememory and how it kind of comes back to haunt you. And so this idea of gaps is something that you've done a lot of work on. So for example, she actually claims that she writes to fill in the gaps of Black American writing. So we talked about how previous accounts by female slaves who'd been freed had to sanitize their accounts so that a white audience wouldn't be offended by them, and how Morrison's work kind of moves that on because she doesn't have to be so kind of politically careful, I suppose, because we're a more liberated society now. So she works in a dialogic way with lots of different voices. She doesn't retreat from the brutality and the psychological trauma, and so she fills in gaps. So you might want to debate the extent to which those gaps are there in a modern post-colonial novel. This purple box, I think, is probably the most useful when it comes to gaps. So important absences in the novel. Denver's deafness. What does she miss out on because she's deaf? Sixo's muteness. What does he kind of, I suppose, I don't want to say miss out on, but how does his refusal to comply with the kind of rules of English, I suppose, pan out? The black scratches that Paul D can't read in the newspaper, the fact that he can't read. Baby Sug claiming that the word has been took away from her. Ella listening for the holes in those stories from fugitives. So it could be that you're looking for missing plot elements or just missing characters actually in those people who went overboard in the middle passage, for example. So think about where the gaps are. Is it missing our black experience or white experience, or are both bits a bit sketchy? And finally, here is where you might want to look for some help with beginnings, endings, settings, and narrative style, all from Cliff Notes and Spark Notes. Really accessible, really interesting. But please don't forget JSTOR. So like I said, JSTOR has been open and given free access for this time of coronavirus, which is probably the one silver lining, guys, for us as students. And honestly, it is brilliant. So if you are already really interested in something in particular, so you might be really interested in Morrison's structure or Morrison's narrative gaps, go to JSTOR and see if there are any articles on it. Yeah, so you might type in Morrison, Beloved, Gaps, Motherhood, if that's the theme and the narrative element you're interested in. It might be Morrison, Beloved, Memory, and Structure, something like that. Okay, so please use everything that's in this PowerPoint to look at one narrative feature and one key theme. If you've got any questions, please email me and let me know. Good luck.